My father said, "Walking you down the aisle would be disrespectful to your stepmother," 2 weeks before my wedding. I was sitting in my childhood bedroom, looking at old photo albums when my father knocked on the door. I'd come over to pick up my grandmother's pearl necklace that I wanted to wear at my wedding. He sat down on the edge of my bed and told me he needed to talk to me about something important. I figured he was going to get emotional about his little girl getting married. Instead, he told me that he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. He explained that my stepmother Diane felt it would be inappropriate for him to walk me when he'd already walked her daughter Kennedy down the aisle 3 years ago. I asked him how that made any sense. He said that Diane believed it would look like he was playing favorites if he did the same thing for me that he did for Kennedy. I reminded him that I was his actual biological daughter, and that Kennedy was his stepdaughter of 8 years. He said that biology didn't determine family, and that I needed to be more considerate of Diane's feelings. I asked him whose idea this really was. He admitted that Diane had brought it up, but that he agreed with her logic. I sat there trying to understand what I was hearing. My father had walked a woman's daughter from her first marriage down the aisle at her wedding, but refused to do the same for his own flesh and blood, because it might upset that same woman. I asked him if he understood how backwards that sounded. He told me I was being selfish and that marriage was about compromise. I said I wasn't married to Diane, so I didn't need to compromise with her. He said that comment was exactly the kind of attitude that made Diane feel unwelcome in our family. I wanted to scream that Diane had made me feel unwelcome in my own family for the past 8 years, but I knew it wouldn't matter. My father had chosen his side a long time ago. I took my grandmother's pearls and left without saying goodbye. When I got home, I told my fiancé Nathan what happened. He was furious on my behalf and offered to talk to my father man to man. I told him not to bother because my father's mind was made up. Nathan asked who I wanted to walk me down the aisle instead. I said I'd walk myself before I gave my father the satisfaction of seeing me beg. The next 2 weeks were torture. Diane called me 3 times to explain that she hoped I understood her position, and that she really did see me as family. I didn't answer. Kennedy texted me saying she'd heard what happened and that she thought her mom was being ridiculous, but that she didn't want to get involved. I didn't respond to her either. My father sent me an email that was clearly written by Diane saying that he loved me, and that he hoped I would come to see this as an opportunity to show my independence as a modern woman. I deleted it without finishing. The day of my wedding arrived and I felt strangely calm. My mother had passed away when I was 12, and I'd always imagined my father being there for the big moments she couldn't attend. But I'd learned to stop expecting things from him years ago. The ceremony was held at a vineyard outside of town. Nathan's family filled one side of the aisle, and my small collection of aunts and cousins and friends filled the other. My father and Diane and Kennedy sat in the second row, because I'd asked my aunt to make sure they weren't in the front. When the music started, I walked down the aisle alone. I kept my head high and my eyes on Nathan, waiting for me at the altar. I didn't look at my father. I didn't need to. The ceremony was beautiful, and Nathan cried when he said his vows, which made me cry too. After we were pronounced husband and wife, we walked back down the aisle together and everyone cheered. At the reception, my aunt gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then cry. Nathan's father gave a toast that welcomed me to their family with so much warmth that I almost lost it completely. Then it was time for the father-daughter dance. I'd removed it from the program weeks ago, but I hadn't told anyone except Nathan and the DJ. When the DJ announced that we'd be skipping to the bouquet toss, I watched my father's face from across the room. He looked confused, then hurt, then angry. Diane leaned over and whispered something in his ear. He stood up and walked toward me. I was standing with Nathan's mother when my father approached and asked why there was no father-daughter dance. I told him there was no father to dance with. He said that was cruel and unnecessary. I told him that walking your daughter down the aisle was a tradition, and he'd decided traditions didn't matter when they inconvenienced his wife, so I figured I'd apply the same logic. His face turned red and he opened his mouth to respond, but Nathan appeared beside me and asked if everything was all right. My father's mouth hung open mid-word when Nathan stepped closer to me. I felt Nathan's hand settle on the small of my back, warm and steady, and for a second everything in the reception hall seemed to pause. Then Nathan's brother Damon moved between us and my father, not aggressively but definitely intentional, creating a wall of person that made it clear the conversation was over. My father blinked at Damon like he couldn't quite process what was happening. The music kept playing somewhere behind us, and I could hear people laughing at one of the tables near the dance floor, completely unaware of the tension crackling in our little corner. Nathan leaned down close to my ear and asked quietly if I wanted to leave, if this was too much, if we should just go. His voice was gentle, but I could feel how tense his body was next to mine, ready to get me out of there if I said the word. I shook my head and told him no way, absolutely not, because I refused to let my father chase me out of my own wedding reception. Nathan squeezed my hand and nodded, then guided me away from where my father still stood looking shocked. Damon stayed put for another few seconds, just standing. A few guests near them pretended to be very interested in the cake options, while obviously listening to every word. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Diane was mad that her plan had backfired, and my father was probably trying to figure out how to salvage his image. My aunt materialized beside me so suddenly I almost jumped. She took my hand and squeezed it hard, her eyes bright, and told me she'd been waiting 8 years to see someone stand up to him like that. Her voice was fierce and proud, and it made my throat tight. She said Nathan was a keeper, and that she was glad I'd married someone with a spine. Unlike Sir, she said I'd embarrassed my father in front of everyone, and that's not how family treats each other. The words came out smooth and practiced like she'd rehearsed them on the walk over. I looked at her hand on my arm, and her face brightened for a second like she thought she'd won. Then I pulled my arm away and turned my back on her. I walked straight toward where Nathan's parents were standing near the bar. I didn't look back, but I felt Diane standing there behind me, probably trying to figure out what just happened. Nathan appeared at my side again, and his mother reached out to hug me without saying anything, just pulled me in and held on tight. My father and Diane left maybe 10 minutes later. They made a whole production of it too, gathering their things loudly and saying goodbyes to people near the door in voices that carried across the room. Several guests definitely noticed, and a few looked uncomfortable or confused. Kennedy didn't leave with them. She stayed in her seat at a corner table, hunched over a drink, looking like she wanted to sink through the floor. I saw her glance toward the exit when my father and Diane walked out. Then she looked down at her glass and didn't move. Freya came up beside me and linked her arm through mine without asking if I was okay or making a big deal of anything. She just announced in this bright, loud voice that it was time for the bouquet toss and started pulling me toward the middle of the dance floor. Suddenly, Nathan's cousins were there, and my friends from college and my aunt, all of them crowding around me with big smiles like we were going to have the best time. The DJ caught on quick and started playing upbeat music and calling all the single ladies to the floor. The energy in the room shifted so fast it almost gave me whiplash, from tense and awkward to fun and celebratory. The reception actually became joyful after my father left. It sounds terrible to say, but it's true. The whole room felt lighter, like someone had opened windows and let fresh air in. People laughed louder and danced more and stopped throwing worried glances at our family drama corner. Nathan's father found me during a slow song and asked if he could have this dance. We moved onto the floor together, and he told me he was honored to have me as a daughter, that his son had chosen well, that he could see I was strong and kind, and exactly the kind of person he'd hoped Nathan would find. His voice was thick with emotion, and his eyes were wet. I started crying a little, but they were good tears for once, the kind that come from feeling valued instead of rejected. He hugged me tight when the song ended and told me I always had a family with them, no matter what. I realized standing there in his arms that this was what having a supportive father figure felt like, this warmth and acceptance without conditions or scorekeeping. Kennedy approached me near the end of the night when I was saying goodbye to some of Nathan's relatives. She looked nervous and kept twisting her hands together. She said she needed to apologize for not speaking up sooner about her mother's behavior. Her voice was quiet and rushed, like she was afraid I'd walk away before she finished. She said she'd always been scared of Diane's reactions, that she'd learned to just go along to keep the peace. But watching me set boundaries tonight made her realize how messed up their whole dynamic was. She said she was sorry for texting me that she didn't want to get involved because she should have gotten involved. She should have told her mother she was being ridiculous. I looked at Kennedy standing there looking miserable and conflicted, and I told her I understood. I told her I needed some time though, that tonight had been a lot, and I couldn't process everything right now. She nodded fast and said she understood, that she'd be there whenever I was ready to talk. She hugged me quickly and then left before I could say anything else. 3 days into our honeymoon at this beach resort with white sand and clear water, Nathan and I finally had time to just sit and talk about everything that happened. We were on our balcony watching the sunset with drinks we'd made too strong and our feet propped up on the railing. Nathan said he'd never been more proud of anyone than when he watched me walk down that aisle alone. He said watching my father's face when he realized there would be no dance was satisfying in a way he didn't expect, that he'd wanted to punch my father for months, but seeing him face the consequences of his choices was better. We talked about what boundaries we wanted going forward. Nathan said whatever I decided he'd support completely, that if I wanted to cut my father off entirely, he'd back me up, and if I wanted to try to rebuild something, he'd be there for that too. He said the only thing he cared about was protecting me from being hurt like that again. I leaned against his shoulder and watched the sun turn the ocean orange and red. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe all the way. The email from my father came through on my phone while we were having breakfast by the pool. The subject line said, "We need to talk about your behavior," in all caps. I showed it to Nathan and we both just stared at it for a second. Then Nathan started laughing, this genuine amused laugh, and I started laughing too at the absolute nerve of it. We sat there giggling like kids at the idea that my father thought he had any right to lecture me about behavior after everything he'd done. I deleted the email without reading past the first line that started with, "I'm very disappointed." Nathan flagged down a server and ordered us these fancy tropical drinks with fruit and umbrellas. We toasted to not letting my father invade our honeymoon, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks, maybe months. The rest of that day we swam and ate too much food and didn't check our phones once. When we got home from the honeymoon, there were 2 letters waiting in our mailbox. Both had my father's return address, and the second one had urgent, written across the front in red marker. Nathan pulled them out and held them up, asking if I wanted him to just throw them away without opening them. Part of me wanted to say yes, but I told him I should probably read them, that I needed to know what I was dealing with. We sat on our couch and I opened them one at a time. The first letter said I'd caused a scene at my wedding by removing the father-daughter dance without telling anyone. It said I'd disrespected Diane and made the whole event about my hurt feelings instead of celebrating marriage. The second letter was longer and angrier. It said I was manipulated by Nathan and that I'd changed since getting engaged. It said Diane was heartbroken by my behavior, and that I owed her an apology. Both letters ended with demands that I call him immediately to discuss this like adults. I read them out loud to Nathan, and his jaw got tighter with each sentence. I got out my laptop and sat at our kitchen table. Nathan pulled up a chair beside me, and we started writing a response together. I typed out what I wanted to say, and Nathan helped me edit it, making sure it was firm but not mean, clear but not cruel. The letter explained that his choice not to walk me down the aisle had natural consequences. I wrote that removing the father-daughter dance was my decision to make, and I wouldn't apologize for protecting myself from more hurt. Nathan suggested adding a section about boundaries, and I typed it out carefully. No unannounced visits to our home, no communication through other family members trying to guilt-trip me. Any future relationship would require genuine accountability from him, not apologies for how I felt, but actual ownership of what he'd done. I read it over 3 times, changing words here and there. Nathan read it and said it was perfect, that it said everything it needed to say without being something I'd regret later. I saved it to send in the morning when I had the courage to actually hit the button. I clicked send on the email the next morning while Nathan made coffee in our kitchen. My hands shook a little as I watched the message disappear from my drafts folder. Nathan came over and kissed the top of my head and told me I did the right thing. I closed my laptop and tried to focus on breakfast, but my stomach felt tight. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was at work. I saw my aunt's name on the screen and stepped outside to take the call. She sounded almost excited when she started talking. Diane had been calling everyone in the family, apparently. My cousins and my uncle, and even some relatives I barely talked to anymore. She was telling them all that I'd humiliated my father at my own wedding, that I was vindictive and cruel for removing the father-daughter dance without warning. My aunt laughed a little when she said it. She told me that most of our relatives shut Diane down immediately. My cousin Sarah apparently told Diane that my father humiliated himself by refusing to walk his own daughter down the aisle. My uncle said he didn't want to hear about it and hung up on her. Even my grandmother's sister, who I hadn't seen in years, told Diane she was out of line. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing this. I'd always thought my extended family saw me as difficult or dramatic because that's what my father implied whenever I complained about Diane. But they saw through her. They knew what she was doing. My aunt said she just wanted me to know I had more support than I probably realized. I thanked her and went back inside feeling lighter than I had in days. 2 weeks after the wedding, I was still in my pajamas on Saturday morning when I heard a knock at our apartment door. Nathan was in the shower, so I walked over and looked through the peephole. My father stood in the hallway looking angry and determined. My whole body went cold. I backed away from the door as Nathan came out of the bathroom with a towel around his waist asking who it was. I told him it was my father, and Nathan's expression changed immediately. He pulled on sweatpants and a shirt faster than I'd ever seen him move. The knocking got louder, and then I heard my father's voice demanding to see me, saying he knew I was home because my car was in the parking lot. Nathan walked to the door and opened it just enough to stand in the frame blocking the entrance. His voice was calm but firm when he spoke. He told my father he needed to leave. My father tried to push past him, but Nathan didn't move. He said showing up unannounced violated the boundaries I clearly stated in my letter, and that my father needed to respect those boundaries, or there would be consequences. My father's face turned red and he started yelling that I was his daughter and he had a right to talk to me. I walked to the door and stood beside Nathan. I told my father through the screen that he needed to respect my boundaries, or there would be no relationship at all. My father looked at me like I'd slapped him. His face got even redder and he said I was manipulated by Nathan, that I never acted like this before I got married. Nathan actually laughed at that. He said maybe I never had someone supporting me enough to stand up for myself before. My father opened his mouth and closed it again. He had no response to that truth. He stood there for another few seconds looking between Nathan and me like he was waiting for one of us to break. When neither of us did, he turned and walked away down the hallway. Nathan closed the door and locked it. I realized I was shaking. Nathan pulled me into a hug and I stood there trying to catch my breath. But I also felt strangely powerful. Nathan had physically stood between me and my father's boundary violations, and I'd held my ground. We called Nathan's parents an hour later to tell them what happened. They invited us for dinner immediately, saying family supports family. That evening at their house, Nathan's mother hugged me tight when we walked in. She said she was sorry my father couldn't see what an amazing daughter he had. I felt that grief again for the parent relationship I would never have. But I also felt grateful for the family I was building with Nathan. A month after the wedding, Kennedy texted me asking if we could meet for coffee without her mother knowing. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I was curious. I agreed to meet at a cafe across town where we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. Kennedy was already there when I arrived, looking tired and older than I remembered. She ordered a latte and I got tea, and we sat at a corner table away from other customers. She admitted that living with Diane's constant manipulation was exhausting. She said she'd been walking on eggshells her whole life trying to keep her mother happy. I listened and watched her twist her napkin into shreds. She told me watching me set boundaries at the wedding made something click for her. She realized she didn't have to keep sacrificing her own peace for her mother's ego. We talked for almost 2 hours, and I saw my stepsister clearly for the first time. She was someone also damaged by Diane's narcissism, just in different ways than me. When we left the cafe, Kennedy hugged me and thanked me for meeting her. The next week, Kennedy told me more about life with Diane. She said her mother had been obsessed with making sure Kennedy's wedding was better than mine. Diane kept comparing everything, keeping score like it was a competition. Kennedy said it made her own wedding day stressful instead of joyful. She admitted she'd felt relieved when she moved out after getting married, but the guilt Diane laid on her for not visiting enough was crushing. I told her about the years of feeling invisible in my own family while Diane played victim. We sat there comparing notes and realizing how many of the same tactics Diane used on both of us. The difference was, Kennedy had lived with it her whole life and thought it was normal. I invited Kennedy to have dinner with Nathan and me the following week. I wanted to keep it separate from all the Diane drama. The three of us had a surprisingly good time. Kennedy and Nathan bonded over their shared love of terrible action movies. We laughed until my sides hurt talking about the worst films we'd ever seen. Nathan told me later he was glad I was building a relationship with Kennedy on our own terms. Kennedy texted me afterward saying she hadn't laughed that much in months, and asking if we could make it a regular thing. I said yes. 3 months after the wedding, I took a pregnancy test in our bathroom while Nathan waited outside the door. The 2 lines appeared immediately. I opened the door and showed him, and we both just stared at it for a minute before he picked me up and spun me around. But the joy got complicated fast. That night in bed, I asked Nathan what role my father would have in our child's life. He got quiet and said he'd been thinking about the same thing. We spent several evenings talking through different options. Supervised visits where my father couldn't be alone with the baby. Limited contact on holidays only. Or no contact at all to protect our child from the same prioritization of step-family that hurt me. I was torn between wanting my child to have grandparents and protecting them from my father's choices. Nathan said whatever I decided he would support completely, but that our child's well-being came first. Before I could make any decision, my aunt accidentally mentioned my pregnancy to my father during a phone call. She called me right after to apologize, saying it slipped out when he asked how I was doing. Within hours, I got an email from my father. The subject line said congratulations in all caps. I opened it and felt my blood pressure spike as I read. He assumed he would be an involved grandfather. He included suggestions for nursery colors and asked when we planned to find out the gender. The presumption that he automatically got access to my child after refusing to walk me down the aisle made me furious in a way I didn't expect. I showed Nathan the email, and he read it with his jaw clenched tight. We sat down that night and created a detailed plan for grandparent boundaries. Any relationship with our child would require genuine accountability from my father first. Real apology, not just sorry for how I felt. Acknowledgement of what he'd actually done wrong. Commitment to treating me with respect going forward. I drafted an email explaining that being a grandparent was a privilege earned through respect and healthy relationships, not an automatic right. I wrote that I would not expose my child to someone who couldn't prioritize their own daughter's feelings. The email sat in my drafts for 2 days while I tweaked the wording. I sent it to Freya to read over. She called me immediately and said it was perfect. She said I was protecting my child the way I wished someone had protected me from Diane's influence all those years. I saved the final version and told Nathan I needed one more night to be sure. He said take all the time I needed because this decision would affect our whole family. I sent the email the next morning after Nathan read it one more time and nodded. The send button felt heavy under my finger, but I pressed it anyway. We went about our day trying not to think about it, but every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. 3 days passed with nothing. Then a week, then 2 weeks. I started to relax into the silence. My aunt called to check in, and I told her about the email and the boundaries. She said she was proud of me for protecting my child before they were even born. Kennedy texted asking how I was feeling and if I needed anything. I told her I was good, and asked how the apartment search was going. She said she'd looked at 3 places and was putting in an application for one near downtown. I told her that was great and meant it. At my next doctor appointment, Nathan held my hand while we listened to the heartbeat through the Doppler. The sound filled the small exam room, and I watched Nathan's face light up. The doctor said everything looked perfect and asked if we had any questions. I asked about stress during pregnancy, and she said some stress was normal but to try to minimize it where possible. I thought about my father's silence and realized it was actually helping. No angry letters meant no spike in blood pressure. No manipulation attempts meant I could focus on growing a healthy baby. The doctor scheduled our anatomy scan for the following month and said we could find out the gender then if we wanted. Nathan squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I recognized my father's handwriting on the envelope, and my stomach clenched. I set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it. Nathan came home from work and found me still standing there. He asked if I wanted him to read it first. I shook my head and opened it. The letter was 2 pages long. My father started by saying he was sorry I was hurt by his decision about the wedding. He said he never intended to cause me pain. Then he said that Diane's feelings had to be considered too, because they were married, and that's what marriage meant. He wrote that he hoped I could understand his position now that I was married myself. He said he was excited to be a grandfather and asked when the baby was due. He suggested we could work out a visitation schedule that worked for everyone. The last paragraph said he hoped I could move past this for the baby's sake, because family was important. I read it twice to make sure I understood what I was reading. Then I handed it to Nathan. He read it standing next to me at the counter. When he finished, he looked at me and asked if I saw it too. I asked what he meant. He pointed to the second paragraph and said my father was apologizing for my feelings, not his actions. He said there was no actual acknowledgement of what he'd done wrong. No understanding of why walking Diane's daughter down the aisle but refusing to walk me was hurtful. No accountability for choosing his wife's comfort over his daughter's wedding. Just sorry you feel that way, and let's move forward because I want access to your baby. I felt something shift in my chest. Nathan was right. This wasn't an apology. This was my father trying to use my child as leverage to avoid actually dealing with what he'd done. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Nathan asked what I was doing. I said I was writing back one more time to make things absolutely clear. He pulled up a chair next to me and put his hand on my shoulder while I typed. I wrote that I appreciated him reaching out, but that his letter confirmed what I already knew. I wrote that apologizing for how I felt was not the same as apologizing for what he did. I wrote that until he could acknowledge that refusing to walk his biological daughter down the aisle while walking his stepdaughter was wrong, we had nothing to discuss. I wrote that being a grandparent was a privilege earned through respect and healthy relationships. I wrote that if he couldn't prioritize his daughter, then he wouldn't have access to his grandchild. I wrote that I would not negotiate on this boundary, and that the decision was entirely his to make. The email sat in my drafts for 3 days. I read it every morning and every night. I changed a few words. I deleted a sentence and added it back. Nathan asked if I was sure, and I said no, but I was doing it anyway. On the third night, I read it one more time with Nathan sitting beside me. He asked if I meant every word. I said yes. He said then send it. I clicked send and closed the laptop. We sat there in the quiet of our kitchen, and I waited to feel something. Regret maybe, or fear. Instead, I just felt tired. Nathan asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know yet, but I would be. Weeks went by with no response. My inbox stayed empty of emails from my father. No letters arrived in the mail. Kennedy called me one afternoon while I was folding laundry. She said she needed to tell me something. I asked what. She said Diane had been ranting for days about being excluded from the pregnancy. She said my father mostly stayed quiet during these rants, but that he looked sad. She said she thought he wanted to reach out, but didn't know how without admitting Diane was wrong. I asked Kennedy how she was doing. She said she'd signed the lease on her apartment and was moving out next weekend. She asked if Nathan and I could help her move. I said yes without hesitating. My pregnancy progressed into the 4th month without the constant stress of my father's manipulation. My doctor commented that my blood pressure was excellent. I started showing enough that strangers could tell I was pregnant. Nathan's mother called every week to check in and ask how I was feeling. She never mentioned my father. She never asked if we'd heard from him. She just asked about me and the baby and if we needed anything. At my anatomy scan, we found out we were having a girl. Nathan cried in the exam room while the technician printed pictures. I cried too, but for different reasons. I was happy about the baby, but sad that my father was missing this. Then I reminded myself that he was choosing to miss it. Nathan's parents invited us over for dinner the following Saturday. We drove to their house in the suburbs, and Nathan's mother answered the door with a huge smile. She hugged me carefully and asked how I was feeling. I said good and meant it. Nathan's father gave Nathan a hug and shook my hand, then pulled me into a hug too. We sat down to eat, and halfway through dinner, Nathan's mother cleared her throat. She said they had something they wanted to share with us. Nathan's father smiled and said they'd been working on a project. Nathan asked what kind of project. His mother said they were converting their guest room into a nursery for when we visited with the baby. She pulled out paint samples from her purse and spread them on the table. She asked which colors I liked best. I stared at the samples and felt my throat get tight. She was asking my opinion. She was including me in decisions about my child. She was treating me like I was truly her daughter. I pointed to a soft yellow and said I liked that one. She smiled and said that was her favorite too. Nathan's father said they'd already ordered a crib and changing table. He said they wanted us to feel comfortable bringing the baby over anytime. Nathan reached under the table and took my hand. I squeezed it hard. The contrast between this warm inclusion and my father's absence hit me like a physical thing. But sitting there with Nathan's parents planning for our daughter, I realized something. Chosen family could be just as real as blood. Maybe more real because it was based on actual care instead of obligation. Kennedy and I met for coffee the next week to plan the baby shower. She brought a notebook full of ideas and was genuinely excited. We picked a date 6 weeks out and started making a guest list. She asked if I wanted to do a theme. I said not really. She said okay, and wrote down no theme. We talked about food and games and decorations. She mentioned she'd moved into her apartment over the weekend. I asked how it felt. She said weird, but good. She said Diane had called her 4 times already trying to guilt her into coming back. I asked if she was going to. She said no. She said living on her own was the first time she'd felt like she could breathe in years. I told her I was proud of her. She looked surprised, then smiled. The baby shower happened on a sunny Saturday in May. Kennedy had rented a small event space and decorated it with yellow and white balloons. Nathan's whole family came. My aunt drove in from 2 hours away. Freya brought her new boyfriend. My cousins came with their kids. Kennedy greeted everyone at the door and directed them to the food table. I sat in a chair that Kennedy had decorated with ribbons and opened presents. Baby clothes and blankets and books and toys piled up around me. Nathan's mother had bought us a stroller. My aunt gave me my mother's baby blanket that she'd been keeping safe. Freya got us a year's supply of diapers and said she'd calculated how many we'd need. Kennedy's gift was last. She'd made a photo album with pictures of us from when we were younger. Before Diane. Before everything got complicated. I hugged her and she hugged me back hard. No one mentioned my father. But I caught Nathan's mother watching me during the gift opening with kind understanding in her eyes. She knew what it meant to celebrate without certain family members. She knew the bittersweet nature of joy mixed with loss. When the party wound down and people started leaving, she helped me pack up the gifts. She asked if I was okay. I said yes, and I meant it. I was surrounded by people who actually showed up for me. People who celebrated without conditions. People who loved without keeping score. That was worth more than blood relation. That was real family. At 7 months pregnant, I got one more letter from my father. I knew it was from him before I opened it because of the handwriting on the envelope. But this handwriting was different. Shaky. Some words were darker than others, like he'd pressed too hard. I opened it sitting on the couch with my feet up. The letter was short, just 1 page. My father wrote that he missed me. He wrote that he wished things were different. He wrote that he didn't know how to fix this without betraying Diane. He wrote that he hoped I was healthy, and that the baby was healthy. He wrote that he thought about me every day. The sentences trailed off in places like he'd lost his train of thought. There was no mention of the wedding. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just honest admission that he was choosing Diane over me and couldn't figure out how to do anything else. I read the letter 3 times. The honesty was almost worse than the manipulation. At least manipulation meant he was trying to get something. This was just resignation. This was him saying he knew he was wrong, but he was going to keep being wrong anyway. I filed the letter in a folder with all the others. Then I went back to folding tiny baby clothes and preparing for my daughter's arrival. Nathan came home and asked if I was okay. I said I was. He asked if I wanted to talk about it. I said no. He kissed my forehead and started making dinner. I watched him move around our kitchen and felt grateful for the family I'd built, the one that chose me back. Our daughter arrived 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning. Labor was long and hard, and Nathan held my hand through all of it. When she finally came out crying and perfect, the nurse placed her on my chest. Nathan cut the cord with shaking hands. The hospital room filled with visitors within hours. Nathan's parents came first. His mother cried, holding our daughter. His father told her she was lucky to have such a strong mother. My aunt arrived with flowers. Freya came straight from work, still in her scrubs. Kennedy showed up with a giant teddy bear and tears in her eyes. They all took turns holding my daughter and crying happy tears. Nathan's mother asked what we were naming her. We said Clare, after my mother. She smiled and said that was perfect. I looked around the hospital room at all these people who had shown up, who had celebrated with me through pregnancy, who had supported me through family drama, who were here now to welcome my daughter into the world. My father's absence was a permanent loss. I felt that. But it was also a gift of clarity. I'd built exactly the family I needed. People who understood what real family meant. People who showed up without conditions. People who loved without keeping score. Claire would grow up surrounded by that kind of love. She'd never wonder if she was less important than someone else's feelings. She'd never have to compete for her parents' attention. She'd know what it felt like to be chosen first. And that was worth everything.